Welcome to the Pebble in My Shoe podcast. I'm Miffy Hold, your host here, and each episode I'm in conversation with my guests about the pebble in their shoe that has nudged them to choose a life that aligns them closer to their truth and authentic self. The pebble in my shoe is an analogy for an inner niggle or knowing that becomes so insistent that we have to pay attention. We can ignore it only for so long and eventually have to stop to investigate it, listen to it, and honour what it's telling us. It becomes a catalyst for action to change something that no longer serves us. This can be something internal, like a belief or mindset. It can be about how we behave in certain situations or relationships, or it can be something that changes our life trajectory, like ending a relationship, changing careers, or moving to a different place. Taking the action and making the change invariably requires courage, often a leap of faith, and at the very least, to try something new and outside of our comfort zone. Whatever the action or change happens to be, the pebble ultimately moves us to live more authentically, more aligned to our true nature. My intention for the conversations here is to inspire or offer hope to those of you who resonate with the stories shared, that you'll hear something that supports you on your own journey, and if there's a pebble in your shoe, that you'll find the courage to make the changes that align you closer with your authentic self. Thank you for being here, and let me introduce today's guest. Aine Morris is head of global for ethical tea brand Wilden.herbals. She writes the Substack newsletter Reap and Sow, exploring the reality of 20 years working with UK hospitality. She was managing director of the Bristol Food Union, a social enterprise born out of the COVID-19 crisis, when a group of the city's independent restaurants and food businesses came together to help keep Bristol fed. Aine has also headed up brand partnerships and food programming for Yeo Valley's annual music and food festival, Valleyfest. Prior to the crisis, Aine was chief executive of the Abergavenny Food Festival and was previously director of communications at the Sustainable Food Trust. With an undergraduate degree from Slow Foods University of Gastronomic Sciences, Aine is passionate about how to build an inclusive, participatory UK food system that's resilient enough to withstand the future impacts of the climate crisis. Aine also attended my wedding last year as a guest with my friend Letty, and so I know she's great crack. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Aine.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a bit first, Aine, about yourself, please. I know I've given an introduction there, but where are you and what are you about at the moment?
At the moment, I'm on the road, so to speak, and I was really keen to speak to you this week. I think the timing of this conversation feels quite pertinent for me. Listening to you read my bio back to me, I'm someone who on paper has had a relatively successful career in the kind of food festivals and hospitality world. And I'm also someone who, particularly during and after the pandemic, became extremely clear about a multitude of different ways in which my life was no longer working for me. I think maybe it happens to quite a lot of us that we grow up and we carry with us whatever experiences we may have had as a child. And for some of us, if those experiences were relatively traumatic in some ways, there's a great fire and there's a great energy to move forward and to get things done and to get away from where you came from. But I think what I've really learned is that that's the kind of energy that will only take you so far before it burns out, essentially. And so I found myself in a situation by the end of the pandemic where I was extremely burnt out and almost non-functional to a certain extent, and really had to go through this quite significant collapse in order to kind of find myself again and come out of the other side much, much clearer about both who I am as a person and what I want out of this next phase of my life.
Yeah. So, Aine, I'd really like to hear more about the burnout phase, actually. You know, I feel myself that sometimes burnout sneaks up on us. We don't necessarily realize we're burned out until we stop and crash. And then it's like, crikey, that is burnout. So can you tell me what it was like for you?
It's so funny because I can look back on it now with a broader perspective, whereas when you're in it at the time and it's happening to you, I think it's actually really difficult to recognize it for what it is. So what I know now, looking back, is that I began to get really quite burnt out actually around 2016, which is nearly 9 years ago now. So it's been a journey, it would be fair to say. But I have this distinct, very clear memory of finishing a food event. And I'd always worked in festivals and large scale events, which are very intensive, deadline driven, require a huge amount of energy and commitment to get them over the line. And I have this absolute clear memory of lying down on a floor in a tent behind a countertop with tears just pouring down the sides of my face because I was so relieved that the event was over, that the thing had been delivered. And I think what I really could, I nearly said should have, and I'm trying very hard not to have should haves at the moment. But I think what I now can really see reflecting back is I really wasn't enjoying my work very much anymore. The stress and the pressure and the commitment involved in delivering these events. I never got that feeling where, you've done all the hard work and the party's all kicking off and everybody's there and having a wonderful time. And you look around you and you think, didn't we do something brilliant? And I never really got that. The hard work is all worth it because the benefit and the payoff is X or Y. Actually, I think by the time I'd finished delivering these events, I was so physically and mentally on the floor that my internal self-critic is always, since childhood, been extremely strong. And all I could ever see was the ways in which we could have done it better or the ways in which we could have done it differently. I think really the burnout set in around 2016, and I carried on doing the job I was doing right the way through to 2020. And then during the pandemic, when we took on yet another, huge, great big project, my sense of personal identity had become so tied up in what it was I delivered in terms of professional output and achievement, that what it was covering up really was that in the quiet moments on the inside, I was extremely self-critical and quite ashamed of my behavior and my relationships and some very unhealthy dynamics that were going on in my personal life, and that the split between those two things, who I perceived myself to be seen as on the outside versus the reality of who I believed myself to be on the inside, gradually got wider and wider and wider apart.
Wow. And
I think in the end I was just running kind of frenetically, trying to maintain this, position, professional profile, reputation as someone who really achieved significant things in the world. And actually who I'd come to believe myself to be on the inside was someone who was a disaster and a mess and collapsing and falling down. I mean, I fought the burnout and I fought the stopping for about as long as is humanly possible, to be honest. And when I finally did stop everything altogether and lie down, it took me 6 months to get out of bed again. So
wow. Yeah. Aine, that sounds absolutely horrendous. Like you describe it as this gap between what you perceive you're portraying on the outside and what you perceive is actually what's going on the inside and your beliefs about yourself, and the energy that is required to maintain that position. And clearly you did it for a long, long time until you couldn't do it anymore. And 6 months on the ground then to sort of come back to any semblance of yourself. So I suppose I have lots of questions, but one of the things that I'm curious about is, what was it that kept you going? Like, what was it that maybe stopped you from looking at what was wrong? Because clearly that can't have been comfortable. Like, there must have been so much going on for you internally. So what stopped you from stopping, if you know what I mean?
I honestly feel that such a huge amount of how we end up is related to our childhood programming.
Yeah.
And I'd grown up with an awful lot of chaos and instability. I mean, I'd grown up with parents who had a very violent and abusive relationship. I had grown up with parents who worked in the music industry, or always dealing with big events and festivals. And I had a mother who'd always run businesses and raised the children and managed the finances on her own. And I think my programming, my example of what we, particularly as women, are supposed to be able to carry was unreasonable by anybody's standards, I think, is what I'm beginning to realise. I think often as women, we really tell ourselves we're supposed to be able to do it all. The family, the children, the household, the bill paying, the cleaning. And for me, having a career was always really important to me. Like my sense of professional self. I'd also had children very young. I mean, I became a mum at 20. So I was always someone who was very determined that being a mother wasn't the only thing I would be, that my professional self was also very important to me.
You're saying how we tell ourselves these things, and I think we do, but we're also told by society and our culture that those things are important, and they are important, but that having it all is something that we really should strive for. And I think I've said it here on the podcast before, that our grandmothers and great grandmothers and suffragettes fought for us to have it all, and now we have it all, and it's actually too much, because this idea that we can be mother and career woman and run businesses and run a household, which is essentially running a business all in itself, and raise well-adjusted children and all of those things, and remain sane and whole and complete in ourselves, and beautiful and flawless. Yeah. And
I mean, it's a nonsense when you start to really unpick it. And when you do start to break under the pressure of it all, you feel like it's a you problem, right? It's like the problem wasn't that I was trying to achieve an unreasonable amount of things, or that I was doing it in isolation, completely unsupported by a partner or family that I could rely on. You know, it was the problem was me. I was failing. I wasn't good enough, strong enough, brave enough, working hard enough in order to be everything that everyone needed me to be the whole time.
Yeah. Jesus, just hearing that, Aine, I just feel, the amount of weight that is, isn't it? Like my body just went, Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about those 6 months where you were on your back and unable to function, and what came from that? Because I'm mindful that those are very pivotal times in our lives. Those times are amazing opportunities for growth, and are a bit like, you know, the forest fire that takes everything to the ground and all you have is a charred landscape, but then little shoots begin to come up and suddenly there's growth and things bloom that haven't bloomed in 100 years. So I'm curious about that 6 months for you, Aine, and what came of it for you.
6 months is probably a bit short, to be honest. In reality, it was probably about 18 months to 2 years. But I think I love the analogy of the forest fire. The other one I've really been enjoying recently is the caterpillar to butterfly metamorphosis. In order to become a butterfly, the caterpillar must completely liquefy and become sludge in order to regrow into something more beautiful. And I think that really is a very clear learning that I've taken away with me. There is no easy way around this kind of breakdown and rebuild. Like it's like grief. The only way is to move through it, and it takes a lot longer than you think it will. And you essentially have to let go of everything you thought you knew about who you were and what you thought your life was going to look like. And on the surface, and I think from the outside, it looks like a huge amount of loss. Like half of the Bristol's hospitality industry would probably tell you I went mad and had a breakdown, and that's the end of my story, right? Like, because it really was, you know, I had to let go of my career, I had to let go of my professional identity and reputation, I had to let go of the idea that I was well, I had to let go of the idea, then this is a very difficult one for me, that if I had the ability and the means within myself to fix this on my own, I would have done it by now. And it meant reaching a place where I could acknowledge that this was something bigger than me, that I had no control over my ability to fix it and make it better. And it was only in the acknowledging that I needed help from outside of myself, which I suppose is also what you hear happens with alcoholics or with addicts, or with, you have to reach a point where you acknowledge that if you were able to fix this on your own and just make some small changes that would make your life better, you would have done so by now. Because, you know, I'm not a stupid person, and I'm pretty emotionally articulate, and I'd done the work in terms of the childhood trauma and the therapy and the leaving things behind and the stories we tell ourselves and the limiting self-beliefs. Like, I knew so much about the psychology of my brain, and yet I was stuck in these patterns of repeating these same behaviors again and again and again, seemingly unable to move myself away from, in particular, relationships in my context, whether that's, you know, personal relationships with my ex-husband or relationships with chefs and the hospitality industry. Like, they actually all have the same characteristics. I would work for big, powerful, influential men who behaved a very certain kind of a way, and then I would be very, very triggered by the way they had a tendency to behave, and then be in breakdown about my ability to, like, there was this whole pattern and cycle to the way in which I was living both my personal and professional life. And no matter how much I learned about my own psychology and emotions, I didn't seem able to actually shift the behavior. And I do think I've come to realize we're so influenced by the environment around us. Like, we really are. Like, one of the things that happened, which was one of those green shoots that really made a huge difference to me, was about 1.5 years ago in the November. And I was in complete breakdown, like clearly very depressed, really struggling to get a handle on my emotions. And for the first time ever in my life, I didn't turn to my family or my ex-husband and ask for help, for the first time ever. And what had happened historically, every single time I went to those groups of people to ask for help, was they would tell me that I was the problem, that the problem was my emotions, that the problem was my anger, or I feel too many things, or I've just made terrible choices. My mother telling me, you know, just would tell me my life would be different if only I'd made better choices. And just there was never a softness or a caring or an understanding, or even the ability to look at someone objectively and say, this person is in pain and is struggling and needs some kind of support from somewhere. I kept going to people who I had traditionally been to all of my life, only to be told that the only problem was me and the way that I felt about things. And for the first time ever, I turned to a different group of people. I'd managed to step away from some of those really unhealthy relationships, not necessarily in a positive and constructive way. I just wasn't talking to any of them anymore,
yeah.
Which turns out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made.
Yeah.
And so instead, my options were limited to a different group of people.
Yeah, there's so much in that, Anya. And there's a piece in there around shifting to face another direction, right? So you're looking for help in a place you've never looked for help before, because you've always turned to these other people. You also describe not speaking to them anymore because that is the way to keep yourself safe. And I totally resonate with you there as well, right? Not an easy thing to do either, because you have to stand in your power and put your hand up to somebody and say, no, I'm not engaging with you. And you have those horrible things that we don't want to do. But there's also this gap between how we believe our relationships should be and how they're actually playing out. And therein lies this pull, tug and struggle, right? Because it's not playing out in the way that we believe it should be, or that society believes it should be, and all of that. So I'm curious about that internal shift for you to face another direction, to look for help elsewhere, and what happened for you there, if that's okay to drill into that a bit?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you know, in an ideal world, we're blessed with family and parents who see us and love us and understand us. And when stuff goes wrong in our lives, we turn to them and they parent us in the ways that our inner child needs, and we feel whole and complete and seen, and we can move forward in a healthy way. And I'm sure that there are some people in the world who are blessed with those sorts of relationships in their life, but I really wasn't. And actually, I feel like the reason I was becoming more and more unwell is because I was just so desperate for someone, anybody in my life, to acknowledge that traumatic things had happened to me, and that there were impact and consequences of that trauma that were now affecting my daily life. And when I went looking for those answers, what I got instead was, this is not a me problem, this is a you problem. Don't you bring your pain to my door, off you go. Never mind the stuff that had gone on when I was younger, that was essentially very re-traumatizing for me. Yes. Like to be told that your own story, your own version of reality, your own truth is in fact not true or not. But I'm on the flip side of that is I'm incredibly blessed with some amazing relationships. I went to a fantastic university that gave me a very international network of all kinds of different people. And then one of the key things that happened was that in 2022, I think, I did the School of Myth down in Devon, which is a 6-weekend experiential course run by a storyteller and myth maker, a guy called Dr. Martin Shaw. And I met the most incredible group of women in particular on that course. And we all live, someone's in Scotland, someone's in America. So we're not physically near each other, but we just immediately formed these incredibly deep, connected, soul-led relationships. So between some very old friends from school, of whom Letty Butler, that we discussed earlier, is one of them, the girls from the School of Myth, and then this kind of university network I have, I am really conscious that I've had the privilege and the benefit of holding and maintaining relationships in my life with people who I can have these kinds of conversations with. So what came up when I was finally having the breakdown in November was that I turned to those people for the first time and said, I'm really not okay. And what they did, instead of telling me I was wrong, is they mobilized on my behalf. One of them phoned Letty and said, I'm really worried about Anya. She doesn't seem to be okay. And there was a friend's wedding coming up in Germany and I had no money to go, and someone else mobilized the money to make sure that I could get there. Like, they physically, actively, nobody told me I was wrong or that my feelings weren't valid or that I would just be fine. Like, they heard me say I am not okay, and they took action on my behalf to shift my environment and change the conversation. And it unlocked something in my brain about how the issue was not just me and my emotions. I had some very valid points and concerns that deserved to be heard. But I had been fighting for the last 20 odd years, really, asking for listening from a group of people who had no capacity to give me what I needed.
Yeah.
And when someone shows you the truth of who they are, believe them.
Oh, I love that saying.
And even now, I'm a sucker for, it's my job to fix it, it's my job to change it, it's my job to save them all. So especially all these bloody dysfunctional boys. And I think there is a part of it that's because I have such a great capacity for love, and I see the potential in all of them. Actually, what I've come to realize is that it's not a good thing to see the possibility in everything without any boundaries. Yeah. And without the ability to protect yourself, and without the ability to absolutely input into things, but to acknowledge when a relationship is not able to give you back what you need, and therefore protect yourself by removing yourself from it. That's a very new skill, and I'm still practicing it. And it's a skill that's hard for other people to understand. Try telling people that you consciously have chosen not to have a relationship with either of your parents.
Well, you're sharing a room now with somebody that has done so. I have chosen not to have a relationship with my mother for similar reasons. And some of my children have chosen not to have a relationship with me. So estrangement runs in our DNA, sadly. My mother was estranged from her parents. Funnily enough, my mother grew up in Bristol. Estrangement is not an easy road. We remove ourselves from relationships to protect ourselves often.
I really do see it now, though, as an act of self-care.
Yes.
And maybe I didn't at the time. Maybe it came from a place of, I'm angry and I'm not going to talk to you anymore. But actually, as it's gone on, what I really understand is it's me saying, I deserve better than I am treated in this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that level of internal self-care and self-respect, I choose to disengage. Maybe not forever, maybe not because, and I think this is the thing that they need to understand, is it's not because I'm furious or I'm angry or I'm full of rage, or I am full of love and compassion and care for you and your story and your situation and where you are in your journey. Like I'm not walking around in my life holding on to resentment that you weren't able to give me what I need, because that doesn't serve me and it doesn't serve my children as an example of healthy relationships. I am, for the very first time ever in my life, saying I love myself enough to know that I deserve better than what I'm currently getting from this relationship.
Oh, 100%. You're so articulate, Anya. Thank you so much, because it's beautiful. I use the term beautiful because you are telling a story that I think is actually much more common than we talk about, because I think there's a lot of shame around relationships and families breaking down, but it's massively common, deeply painful. It's such a huge issue that is quite taboo, I think, as well, to discuss. So thank you for being so eloquent about your experience of that.
Sorry about that.
What is the cat? That's okay. The cat is meowing. Can you tell me about why there's a cat meowing in the background?
Well, there's a cat. That was a brilliant segue. Well done. There is a cat meowing in the background because I am currently in a very little attic apartment in Switzerland, looking after 3 cats in exchange for housing until September, because I took the decision earlier on this year to pack up my life in Bristol, put all of my things into storage, and hit the road with my 12-year-old son. And we are temporarily homeless, I've been referring to it as, but that seems to make everyone really uncomfortable. And on Letty's recommendation, I signed up to the Trusted House Sitters website, and it's been an absolute revelation. You can travel around the place and stay in some beautiful homes and houses in exchange for looking after people's pets for them. And also, I think I was conscious that Bristol really wasn't working for me anymore. And that's where we come back to this idea of like shifting your environment as an act of self-care. I was really stuck in a situation in Bristol where my costs were through the roof because I'm a private tenant and I was paying an absolute fortune. I've had a lovely new job since January, and every single month I was being paid and handing over 90% of my income to a landlord. It was all well and good having a breakdown and going to bed for 18 months. But if you're a single parent, single income household like I am, been living month to month since well before the beginning of the pandemic, the luxury of having a breakdown ruined me financially. Like I could go to bed for 6 months, but I couldn't pay my bills. There was a choice to be made there. And to get back on my feet again, I needed to be in a situation where I wasn't just handing everything over to somebody else every month. But then the other side of that is that, you know, I had a breakdown very publicly. I wrote a newsletter about it. I communicated very clearly about how cross I was with a lot of the hospitality industry. And I think when you've burned your professional reputation like that, I went from being someone of quite significant kind of influence and listening to someone who had really lost their listening. And so I could either stay living in a place where I was now perceived to be less than, or broken in some way, or a bit bonkers in some way, I came to the realization that I knew a huge number of people in the city, and I had a hell of a lot of professional acquaintances. But when it came to the people who still stuck around once your fancy job and your position of privilege had disappeared, there were very, very few of them in Bristol, like a cluster of neighbours who lived near me, but really not anybody else very much. And that was a painful lesson to learn. There was a lot of grief involved in that. You can hear that the emotions are not entirely processed on that one.
No, I'd like to pause with that, because I mean, what I hear in that is a huge amount of courage, because you are speaking your truth, you know. So the professional world might label you as lost the plot or not the person you were, but like what you've done is taken off a mask and gone, well, this is me, guys, and the alternative is it's not bed for 6 months, it's end of Anya, you know. And I have to commend you on taking that courageous step to take that time for yourself. In that brokenness, you don't have much choice, but there is that courage. And I don't like the word resilience very much, because I think it's kind of misused and misdefined as bouncing back. And I've said on many occasions, we don't bounce back from adversity. We crawl back on our hands and knees most of the time. We don't bounce. So, but I'm kind of off on a tangent now, but I wanted to acknowledge the courage it takes to step away from your peer group and say, guys, this is actually my truth, and this is actually the way it is and how it's been for me. And I know that a lot of you aren't going to like the taste of it, but you know, this is it. And for you to then pick yourself back up, Anya, and begin that process of reinventing yourself, dare I say.
Yeah, I think I had to come to understand the value of what I have to offer in order to be able to walk away from somewhere where my contribution was no longer valued, right? So that's an act of great self-belief, really. I've always had this kind of clarity. You talk about the pebble in your shoe, you talk about the intuition, you know, I listen into something that's bigger than myself, and on a good day with the wind behind me, I know things. Like I have an incredibly strong sense of intuition, and just like a deeper knowing, like a sense of connecting into something that's so much bigger than each of us in our individual lives. I suppose 150 years ago, we would have called it faith or spirituality, and not felt quite so awkward about it.
I think though too, like Joan of Arc was burned at the stake for this shit, right? So we have that memory as well in our DNA. So when we have what might be termed a breakdown, but can be a breaking open, and in that breaking open, our truth is revealed. And in the reconfiguring that happens then when we start to kind of put ourselves back together with the help of the people who do see us and hear us and love us and rally for us, that intuition remains exposed or available maybe. And I think that the intuition is something that maybe is what we ignore when we're going through life, pushing to succeed, to be all these things that we're supposed to be. And so I think it's not unusual for a person to feel much more spiritually connected after an event like that kind of breaking open.
And I wonder if, you know, I ended up in an industry that was all about you know, party and good food and good wine and consumption, a lot of overconsumption, in part because the idea of reconciling myself to the truth of who I believed myself to be, which was actually something far deeper and was actually too much for my brain to be able to handle in the context of, you know, what we say a normal, modern, successful life is supposed to look like. Part of the reason for the leaping away from Bristol is I couldn't just keep relating to myself in the context of the brokenness. I had to give myself the space and the opportunity and the possibility to really grow into who I know I'm capable of becoming now. And in order to do that, I needed to get away from all those relationships where people were still relating to me like I was this broken version of myself. And what nobody tells you, or I think we talk about very, very little, is that a breakdown and rebuild, it doesn't look like you collapse and then you build it back up again. There was this whole ridiculously long period of just nothingness. I was numb. I didn't feel anything. I wanted to sleep all the time. I had no clue. I knew where I wasn't anymore, but I had no clue where I was. There was part of the School of Myth is amazing because it gives you stories and fairy tales against which to kind of map your and there's a story where she has to grow her hands back after her father chops her hands off, and she ends up, you know, sitting in this woods in a house for months and months on end, and there's just a nothingness to it all. And I think that was something that was completely unexpected in the context of what we get told about what having a breakdown looks like, right? Like, you have a breakdown and then you find a way to pull yourself back together and then you kind of get on with your life. It's actually not like that at all. Like, you reach a point of collapse and you know that you have to let go of a load of things. But for such a long time, I was in the grey space of the kind of not knowing what that meant for me now or where I was going to go next. And as someone who's always had quite a lot of clarity of vision around the future, that was a completely new emotional experience for me, the kind of the nothingness.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's very powerful. And I'm getting a real sense of how we will never be the same again after that kind of an episode, let's call it, in our life, right? How does that feel for you? You know, like when you feel into that newness, because what I'm really hearing is that everything that you knew has fallen away. And here you are rebuilding something from scratch, really, in lots of ways.
Listening to you say it now, the only thing I feel is this overwhelming sense of relief, if I'm honest.
Okay.
I have been running to try and prove to the world that I'm good enough and lovable enough and acceptable enough since I was a child. I'm 42 in a few weeks' time, and I'm a massive believer in life in 7-year cycles. So the fact I'm coming to an end of a 7-year cycle is very interesting to me. And it was a Steiner philosophy, was that every 7 years, every cell in your body is new. So we are remade every 7 years. And I just feel at the moment this kind of I'm full of gratitude just to still be here, because I very nearly wasn't.
Yes.
And I am very conscious of how lucky I am, because I did have the kind of breakdown that was so serious and severe that it would be quite possible not to come back from it in a powerful way, like not necessarily to not be here at all, but just for my life to be diminished in terms of the kind of homes I could live in or the kind of jobs I could do. And I am so lucky to have this incredible network of wonderful people all over the world, that when it was time for me to be like, okay, I can get back into the game, there were opportunities and possibilities there for me, which if I hadn't had the kind of career I'd had before, may not have existed. So I really feel very humbled and full of gratitude. And yes, an awful lot of relationships fell by the wayside, but the ones that that maintained themselves through that period are so strong and so solid and so long term that I'm excited for the future. I still don't know exactly where I'm going. I may not currently have a home as such, but you know, I know where I'm living between now and November, and I get to do work that I like and that will pay my bills, and also start to create space for the work that's to do with really finding powerful ways to speak my truth and to communicate effectively and to tell about my experiences. And then I want to start to move into the space of how do I hold space for other women in particular to feel safe and secure enough to also be able to start to talk about their truths and their realities. And that's where I see my work moving in the longer term, is I want to use the breadth and depth of my experience to be able to hold space for others.
Wow. Yeah.
I feel quite lucky.
Yeah. I have no doubt that is on the cards for you. The word alchemist comes to mind, that you're turning this base metal into gold. And for that, I just say, go you, because that's really, really powerful.
It took me 40 odd years to really move through and past a lot of the things that were causing my life not to be functional. But there's real magic in finding the courage to do the work.
Oh yeah. The reward is being able to stand in your truth, isn't it? For me, that's what it is anyway, and I get a sense that's the same for you. Aine, this is a question I ask quite a lot of my guests, and that is, what message would you have for a younger version of yourself?
Be unconditionally kind to yourself. I was so fiercely awful to myself in terms of my internal narratives that it was basically abusive. I spoke to myself on the inside in an abusive way. And I did an incredible bit of therapy a few years back, like shadow therapy. She got me to speak to my daughter as if she was in the room, and everything was like encouraging and supporting. And then she asked me to reflect on how I spoke to myself in comparison. And I really realized just how awfully and how critical and how negative my internal voice was. My internal critic had become rampantly out of control. My advice to my younger self is, you're doing the absolute best you can with the circumstances that life has gifted you. You will be okay. And in the meantime, be unconditionally kind to yourself.
Yeah. Aine, what difference has making these changes in your life made to you?
I feel free again, I think. The important element of this is I had the experience once before in my life of escaping my environment and my life becoming immeasurably better as a result. So I'd grown up in quite difficult circumstances, and then I'd won this mad scholarship to go to university in Italy. And Italy had completely changed my life, my perspective, my community. It was the first time ever in my life that I understood what it was to live in relationship with others and to feel valued and heard. And then I'd gone back to the UK after university, and slowly over the next 14 years, a massive factor was getting back into a relationship I never, ever should have gone back to. I'd ended up essentially back where I was before I'd left the first time. So when you say to me, it takes a huge amount of courage to do what you've done now, yes, it does. But the flip side of that is, I did it once before and it saved me once before. So I have that context and I have that history of knowing that a great leap can really make a significantly positive difference. I think I just feel free again. I feel like when we take great leaps of faith, the universe has a tendency to reward us, and that we don't always know exactly what that's going to look like. And sitting in the unknown is a deeply uncomfortable experience. If you can just do it anyway and hold on for the ride, I just have this like innate sense of faith and confidence that whatever happens, I'm going to end up somewhere better than where I've been.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. I want to give you a big hug now, Aine.
I know, it seemed like a good time for a chat. I knew we should have a chat now. I think if we'd spoken 6 months ago, it might have been a very different conversation.
Yeah. So as it stands, you're sort of in free fall in a way, but you also have this place to be for now in Switzerland with your son and those lovely cats that you're minding.
Yes, it's not quite as untethered as it sounds. I have a home here until September. For me, really, other than sounding like a very grand adventure, is it puts me in a situation where I can rebuild my financial stability. And then I'm looking for an apartment longer term from probably November, December onwards. But I'm probably going to stay in Italy for a while, because at the moment, my main source of income is I'm working for an Italian herbal tea company founded by an old friend from university. And I'm very, very lucky that I can do that work remotely and from anywhere. Yes, it's a big leap into the unknown, but I'm also not entirely untethered. There is the bones of a plan there.
Talking about being untethered, But, maybe some of that tethering is actually what holds us back. I'm hearing a lot of trusting in the unfolding, where before there was a lot of holding on tight to the plan. And now there is this open to, here's my idea, universe, and let's see what you bring to me, and that's a very powerful place to be as well.
We hear a lot, I think, about this idea of flow, that we have not nearly as much control as so many of us think about the direction our lives end up in, and that the magic of the universe can really unfold when we kind of lean into the flow of things. And I always knew this year was going to be like that, even just from an astrological point of view. This year is all about upheaval and change and shifting, and I just had this really strong sense after Christmas that if I just leaned in and allowed the thing to unfold, things would happen. Any of the girls who've worked for me at any point in the last 12 years, I am not someone who easily relinquishes control. So this is a huge shift for me, not only making the decision to do it, but then feeling comfortable and positive and not panicking. And I have my moments. I mean, I phoned my friend and cried the other evening about whether I was going to end up homeless. I'm not without moments of apprehension or fear, but underpinning that, I think, is this real baseline confidence and solidity that it's the right choices at the right time for the right reasons.
The very fact that you have now come to a place where you're fully aware of your tendency for controlling everything, right? And you are allowing yourself to go on this unpredictable ride. That is the healing, isn't it? That's the work. It's not something that just clicks one day. It's a process. It's a daily application of changing your mindset, of sitting in the discomfort, of trusting this flow, and so on, and having that faith in the universe, and listening to those intuitive nudges and that knowing that you describe. When you said, I just know stuff, we're not taught how to trust that stuff when we just know stuff. And I would really love to see that being on the school curriculums.
I went out of my way to ignore the little intuitive voice in my head about what I was potentially capable of, to the extent that, I nearly killed myself in the process. Like I spent 24 years in the relationship I really shouldn't have been in, rather than take responsibility for, healing my own trauma and finding another route. A huge number of us spend our entire lives never really getting to the nub of, why we put up with the stuff that we do and why we stay in relationships, jobs, families, any friendships that really don't serve us anymore.
Yeah, gosh, Aine, thank you so much for this.
It's been a joy. I'm really happy to speak to you.
Thank you for listening to The Pebble in My Shoe. Aine and I went deep in this conversation and touched on some really poignant and painful, yet common life situations that don't often get talked about. This is what this podcast is about, telling the stories about how things really are and exploring how we can navigate our way to living authentically. I so appreciate how articulately Aine has described her own journey of burnout and breaking open, and all the learning that came from being in that pupation phase of the metamorphosis, how dissolving into something unrecognisable and waiting it out until the transformation begins to take shape and the beginnings of a butterfly emerge with the wings forming and drying in the unconditional light of friendship and self-love. I'm really grateful to Aine for sharing her experience with us here. In the show notes, you'll find a link to Aine's Substack newsletter if you'd like to read more about her journey there. If you've enjoyed listening, please like, subscribe and share it with others. It makes it easier for people to find the podcast. And if you have a story to tell about the pebble in your shoe, please get in touch. I'd love to talk with you about it for the listeners. As well as hosting this podcast, I'm a personal growth coach at the Daisy Coaching Hub, where I provide one-to-one coaching for personal growth, mental health and well-being, group classes for mindfulness and reflective practice, and self-directed resources that support, nurture and energise you on your own personal growth journey. You can follow me on Instagram at Daisy Coaching Hub and also on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can visit my website www.daisycoaching.ie and also subscribe to my newsletter to be the first to know about events and what's new at the Daisy Coaching Hub. I look forward to sharing the next episode of The Pebble in My Shoe with you. Bye for now.